Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Major Danny Sjursen joins the show to talk about the war in Afghanistan, an unsustainable quagmire for which no more blood and treasure should be sacrificed. We also talk about the magical American soldier myth and the Empire Denial Syndrome. Major Danny Sjursen is a U.S. Army strategist and a former history instructor at West Point. He served tours with reconnaissance units in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's written a memoir with critical analysis of the Iraq War titled Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge. He's a co-host of a podcast, Fortress on a Hill, and he's a prolific writer whose articles are published on numerous sites, including The Nation, Truthdig, Tom Dispatch, and antiwar.com. We recorded this interview on October 31st, 2018. Major Sjursen, welcome to Around the Empire. It's great to have you.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So I'm focused on three articles. You've written a lot of articles over the last 2 weeks, and thank you for that. I watch your podcast and I listen to your other interviews. Most recently, I listened to an interview that you did with Scott Horton, and I will link all of these things in the show notes for our listeners because this is a must listen in my view, because they really get into the nitty gritty of this. And anyway, you'll see for yourself. I can't recommend it enough. And also, I also listened to an interview that you did on the 0 Hour. And for that reason, do we need to do any disclaimers or anything like that?
Yeah, so I'll start off like I always have to. I often forget by saying that I am technically, for a little bit longer, still on active duty in the Army. So I'm speaking today in an unofficial capacity, and my opinions are not, and probably aren't specifically, those of the DOD, the U.S. government, or the Army. So with that being said, we can talk about anything.
Right. And Danny Sjursen is a major in active duty, I think, still, as he said, just for a little bit longer before he retires. And I very much appreciate his very candid writing and speaking on the subject. I'm talking about three articles here from antiwar.com. And I want to focus in on one of them, but I do want to touch on some of the others because some of them hit on similar points. The one I'm going to focus on is called Quagmire, What the Attack on General Miller in Afghanistan Tells Us. Because I think maybe, and I hope it's a turning point, this event. But I want to start with the first, if you don't mind, I'd like to read the first couple of paragraphs of another article.
Sure.
Okay. And this one is called Not Worth Another Life, an Afghan Anniversary to Lament. And Danny starts out by saying, the absurd hopelessness was the worst part. No, it wasn't the improvised explosive devices, IEDs, blowing limbs off my boys, or the well-aimed gunshot wounds suffered by others. It wasn't even the horror of ordering the deaths of other enemy human beings. No, for a captain commanding 100-odd troopers in southwest Kandahar province at the height of the Obama surge of 2011, what most struck me was the feeling of futility, the sense that the mission was fruitless operationally, and of course all but ignored at home. After a full year of saturating the district with American soldiers, the truth is we really controlled only a few square feet we stood on. The Taliban controlled the night, the farmlands, the villages, and back in 2011, while the U.S. had about 100,000 servicemen and women in the country, there are less than 15,000 on the ground now. It's an uncomfortable, almost un-American truth. There's nothing more that the U.S. military can do for the founding government of Afghanistan. And as the war reached a lamentable 17th anniversary last week, now is the time to once again raise the alarm. In fact, this next year, teenagers born after 9/11 will begin to join the military and eventually the fight in Afghanistan. As if that's not disturbing enough, for the ostensible republic, consider this. The Afghan war is failing. failing worse than ever before. Along each line of effort, security, politics, and economics, the metrics point downward, despite all the blood and treasure already sunk into America's longest war. And, this hits home for a lot of reasons. I've got 3 sons. They're all now in their early 20s and perfectly ready, military age. And they were just little kids when 9/11 happened. And, let's just start here. I started to tell you a little bit earlier that the previous 2 episodes of Around the Empire, we analyzed a couple of movies, The War Machine, based on Michael Hastings, The Operator's book, and also Charlie Wilson's War, which dug into the stories of why we got into the, all of that, and the myths that are there. And so it's interesting because this futility, this hopelessness that you talk about here, Hastings definitely got that point across. It was more related to the counterintelligence coin strategy at the time, but he definitely got this point across of the soldiers on the ground in there. And the other thing that really hit me was, the fact that kids who were just being born on 9/11 are now going to be going to Afghanistan too. And why are we doing this?
Well, it's really disturbing for me as well. You said you have military age boys. I have a stepson who is 16 years old. He was born in September of 2002, which means he's exactly a year away from being military age, since he was born about a year after 9/11. That is disturbing. It's disturbing for me, not only as a parent, but also as a soldier and an officer. I briefly taught history at West Point, which was the best assignment I ever had back at the academy where I had graduated from. And in 2014, when I taught my first crop of new freshmen, 18-year-old, bright-eyed idealists who want to save the world, amazing people, I used to tell them on the last lesson of the semester that even though they're excited to go to war, my profound hope is that they never will have to. And I used to tell them that the thought of them perhaps having to fight in one of the same wars that I did 10 and 15 years later in either Iraq or Afghanistan, that thought made me want to vomit a trash bin. And that's how I used to end every semester. And they looked at me like I was a little crazy, but some of them got it. And frankly, those students are all now on their way to Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. Mm-hmm. And if I could look one of their mothers or wives or husbands in the eye and explain to them what their loved one just fought and perhaps died for, then maybe it would all be okay. But frankly, I can't do that anymore. And I haven't been able to do that for a long time. And I probably waited too long to speak out against this. But yeah, it is very disturbing for a republic to be at war for 17 years. And frankly, we're not going to be at war for anything less than 17 years. 20 years is going to be the next anniversary, and we're going to hit it. Because whether President Trump remains president or someone else takes over, unless it's someone from the far left or the libertarian right, this is going to continue into at least 20 years. And so I think that's disturbing and something that we have to jump on the mountaintop and scream at the top of our lungs about, because no one's paying attention.
Yeah, we really do. That was another point I wanted to bring up. In your latest podcast, you said, there's no choice anymore. We have to get involved in politics. And frankly, this week before the election, I'm like, I want to go dig a hole and wait until this election is over. But I totally know what you mean. I always feel like I'm not doing enough. I've been writing, or I've been doing this podcast for 2 years. And before that, there were periods of time where almost every day I wrote about the wars, or I was on Twitter, doing things like that. But frankly, it doesn't come up in conversation in real life very often. I did a search, a news search on Afghanistan today because I knew there was another bad incident. In fact, 2 of them. The Taliban claims that they've shot down a helicopter. I don't know if they really did, but some Afghan officials were killed, 25, I think. Right. And also they went to the gate of a prison. I think that one was just outside of Kabul too. And they blew up a bus at the gate of a prison. you know. But I guess what really bothers me the most is, a lot of things bother me, but the thought of our kids over there on a mission where they're advising and training and helping the Afghan forces, and they don't know, I don't know how they can sleep at night, frankly. They don't know who's going to turn around and shoot them. And I don't understand how you can have an advise and assist mission when there are all kinds of sort of saboteurs inside these groups of people who are you're training and assisting and you're needing to build a bond with. And, how do they even sleep? Like, how can they?
Amazingly, we do sleep. Soldiers over there do sleep, mostly from exhaustion. Eventually, people just come to the end of their rope and collapse. But you bring up an amazing point, which is these insider attacks. In the Army, we refer to them as green on blue attacks. The code word for supposed allies is green, and the code word for the good guys, Americans, is blue, and then the code word for the enemy is red, right? So that's just how we sort of label it. That's how we put them on maps. These insider or green on blue attacks devastate the advise and assist mission. I mean, devastate it. Because think about it for a moment. America says we're no longer in a combat role. And to some extent, that's true, although we're dropping a lot of bombs and killing a lot of people. So it really depends on how you define combat. But America says, the American Army says, we are no longer in combat role. We're in an advise and assist role. That means training, advising, and helping out with logistics and air support our Afghan ostensible, quote, allies. In order for that to work, there needs to be an inordinate amount of trust between the two sides, because the trainers and the advisors sleep feet from the Afghans they fight with. I used to sleep behind dirt mounds next to often very smelly Afghans, okay? And so the thought that at any moment one of those people could actually be either disgruntled or a Taliban sleeper cell, like many of them are, and turn their guns on you and shoot you in the back is terrifying. And it erodes all trust, because what it does is it puts distance between the American trainers, the American advisors, and the Afghan officers and soldiers. They don't want to sleep close to each other. They want to be under guard when they're near each other. We've even come up with a new force called the, quote, Guardian Angels. And these are young soldiers who keep all their gear on, keep their rifles at the ready, and watch very carefully to make sure the Afghans don't attack us. Now, think about how that makes the Afghans feel, because 99% of them are good guys. 99% of them are on our team, whatever good guys means anymore, but 99% of them are on our team. They feel like they're distrusted. And the truth is, we don't trust them. And so it erodes this trust, and it creates a division, a schism that really can't be brought back together. Okay, and so there's been 103, I think, by the last count, fatal insider attacks where an American was killed. Okay, and hundreds more where people were wounded. So you can see how this would devastate the mission. Add to that, on top of that, the Afghan economy is a failure. Afghan politics is an absolute corrupt nightmare, and the Taliban is gaining ground in the war itself. So you have the advise and assist mission is failing, and then the other three major lines of effort, politics, economics, and security, are all trending downward, and yet America has said nothing about when we're going to exit Afghanistan. And most American people don't even pay attention because, quite frankly, the media as entertainment complex doesn't even talk about it anymore.
Yeah. There was, I'm not sure if I should go into this, but there's an interview on NBC today with the commanding general in Afghanistan, General Miller, who, just escaped an insider attack himself. And I'm going to nitpick, first of all, because the title that they put on this article, New U.S. Commander in Afghanistan says he's going on the offensive against the Taliban. And now they don't give us the whole article. They give us some big chunks of quotes. And I would say that's like not really what he was saying in this article. He was saying that, he does mention a more aggressive policy of helping the Afghan military track and defeat the Taliban, what he calls regaining the tactical initiative. But he spends more time, in my view, he says, my assessment is the Taliban also realizes they cannot win militarily. Well, So if you realize you can't win militarily at some point, fighting is just people start asking why. So you do not necessarily wait us out. But I think now is the time to start working through the political piece of this conflict. Then he says, we are more in an offensive mindset and don't wait for the Taliban to come and hit us, he said, which I guess is sort of referring to the coin, a rejection of the coin strategy. So he says, so that's an adjustment that we made early on. We needed to because of the amount of casualties that were being absorbed. But he says something else at the end. He says, I naturally feel compelled to try to set the conditions for a political outcome. So pressure from that standpoint, yes. I don't want everyone to think this is forever. And then he says, this is my last assignment as a soldier in Afghanistan. I don't think they'll send me back here in another grade. When I leave this time, I'd like to see peace and some level of unity as we go forward. It makes it much easier to safeguard our vital national interests in this region. So I hear him, and maybe this is just my own confirmation bias, I hear him talking more about a political process and a peace, coming to some kind of peace in this country. And from my understanding, there kind of are some ways to do that. So I'm pissed off at NBC for cherry picking the, going on the offensive against the Taliban. But what do you think could be done? What would be the best thing to do in Afghanistan?
I'm of the opinion that the best thing we can do is leave immediately, cut our losses and go. The only thing we should maintain is a counter-terror mission against actual threats to the United States homeland, of which there are actually very few anymore in Afghanistan. It is time to cut and run, for lack of a better word. We lost in Afghanistan. All due respect to General Miller, who I think his heart is in the right place. From that interview, he does sound a little bit frustrated, and he does sound like he's done this for his whole career, and he really hopes for something better this time, a political solution. But all due respect to General Miller, his optimism throughout most of the interview disturbs me. We have had, I think, 17 commanders in Afghanistan, of which I believe he's the 17th over the last 17 years. And every single one of them, and I've actually done this before for an article, if you laid out their quotes about the war and what they hope to achieve, every one of them says the same thing. Well, we're not there yet, but we're just around the corner. We're going to take the offensive, and we're going to make some progress. You just got to stick with it a little longer, a little longer, a little longer. We're almost there. We're never almost there. We've turned so many corners that we've gone in 7 circles over the last 17 years. Look, it's a messy reality. There will be a political solution to this war, by the way. It won't go on forever. No war goes on forever, but there will be a political solution. Guess what? It'll be an Afghan political solution to an Afghan problem. What's it going to look like? I can't predict for sure. Predictions are very difficult. I'm a historian, so we're not in the prediction business. But I will tell you this. It is likely that Afghanistan will fracture into 2 or 3 pieces. Probably the Taliban is going to win militarily by outlasting the Americans in the south and the east of the country. And probably the Kabul-based government, specifically the Tajik, Uzbek, and Hazara minorities, will band together and hold the north and west of the country. That is probably the most likely outcome. It is unlikely that Afghanistan will ever be a successful centralized state. But here's the thing to remember. It rarely ever was in its history. Mm-hmm. It is divided ethnically. It is divided into sectarian religious groups. And usually the only way to hold Afghanistan together was with a king who had a lot of autonomy for the individual regions, who let the tribal leaders kind of run things themselves in a very federal system. That's the best case scenario. This idea that there's going to be a liberal democracy in the Hindu Kush Mountains because America put it there at the point of a bayonet, that is an absolute fantasy at this point.
Now, the other thing I want to talk about a little bit is empire. My background is not in history or military history or political science or anything like that. I'm a trained engineer, and after that IT. But after we were at war, first of all, after 9/11, I had no idea why we were attacked. Seems silly now, but I really didn't. And then I just could not understand what was going on. And about 10 years ago, I just dug into it, and I haven't come up from it since. And I guess I never realized. I mean, maybe I thought some of the things we were doing were imperial in nature, but now I'm completely convinced that this is an imperial. This is an empire. We have some big partners, other former empires, but only very recently do people start talking about it, framing it in that way. And I don't think our troops signed up for imperial occupations, to be conquering and occupation forces. And nothing I ever hear from the military commanders or even the strategists, they never talk about it that way. They don't like the word occupation. They don't like anything with the word imperial in front of it. But that really feels like what we have morphed into, in this dominance, that we have to achieve. So, are we there? Does the military look at it that way? And I think that Afghanistan is the best example of it. Would be the best argument for it.
Well, Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires, and I think that that's actually appropriate, given what it has done to one supposed empire after another. We're talking about the British, of course, and the Russians, and now the United States. I will tell you this: the U.S. military hates the word empire, just like U.S. policymakers hate the word empire. They do not see what we do as imperial. They see it as defending America by fighting the terrorists there instead of fighting them here. That's a myth. That's a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy for a number of reasons we could get into. They see themselves as benevolent liberals, okay, not liberals with a big L in the American sense, but benevolent Democrats, okay, people who believe in democracy. They see themselves as making the world a better place, like as humanitarians. That is shockingly inaccurate. And I'm going to challenge you, not because I disagree with you, but I'm going to say not only is America an empire now, it was born as an empire, and an empire it has always been. Thomas Jefferson called the United States an empire of liberty. Talk about a contradiction in terms. From the minute we landed on Plymouth Rock, we were conquerors, okay? We were conquerors first of Native Americans. Then we extended our imperial clutch to the southwest and took over the northern half of Mexico. And then in 1898, when there was no more continental land to conquer, we went to the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and took all of those places over from the Spanish. Ever since then, we have been intervening in one place after another. Now, the reason we don't call it empire anymore is because we don't usually annex the country we invade or we intervene in. Rather, we just litter military bases around the world. 900 by last count that I read, in something over 100 countries. We are an empire of bases, and we are an economic empire. To see it any other way is utterly obtuse, and it's profoundly American and profoundly naive to not see yourself as an empire. You know who sees us as an empire? The rest
of the
world. Yeah. And so I think that's it. So when I think of American foreign policy, often I actually think of it as though I wasn't an American. I try to look at it from the point of view of a foreigner, whether that be a European or, more importantly, someone in the greater Middle East.
Yep, I agree with you on that completely. I hadn't really thought of us as an empire from the very start, but that's really interesting thing that I'll dig more into. I've been more like, well, was it after World War II? Was it after the fall of the Soviet Union? I don't know. You could make arguments for that, but that's a pretty strong argument you just made. And so why do we avoid? Why does the military and the foreign policy establishment hate the word empire?
Well, I think it's because it's a little too accurate, and it comes a little too close to home. Sometimes the truth is really hard to face. Think of it this way: if you are a humanitarian spreading global democracy, which is what most soldiers want to think of themselves as, and what most officers want to think of themselves as, then you can really, really feel proud of your identity, can't you? You can be thanked for your service at home. You can feel really nice about the free meals you get on Veterans Day, and you can pat yourself on the back. But if you are fighting as a foot soldier in defense of an American empire or a neo-colonial adventure, which is what I think we are after in a lot of these countries, or neo-imperial is a better word, then suddenly you're not who you thought you were. Your identity isn't so benevolent anymore. It also means that if the enemy kills you, you might have to think to yourself, they had a point. I was in their country. You see, today, if an American soldier dies, what do we say? Oh, those darn terrorists killed him. Those illegal terrorists who we put in Guantanamo Bay, who aren't even really soldiers and aren't even really combatants, right? So we can sort of minimize and dehumanize the other, the enemy, and say, if we die, it's not because we were in their country. But the reality is, if you called it an empire, if you called it what it was, you have to really take a hard look at what it is you do for a living. Now, I'm morally twisted from having come to that realization, and I'll be honest, it's not an emotionally healthy place to be. And most
Yeah.
people don't want to go there. And so I think that's the main reason why. Also, the military wouldn't be able to spread its tentacles around the world so confidently if it was done in the name of imperialism, because that would seem like an empire, and they just don't want to deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really painful. I think it takes a long time. I don't think it's something you can just, a realization you can come to and just accept overnight. It's taken me years. And I thought I was pretty well informed. I was like an NPR liberal for that time. I'm no longer. I'm an independent now. So the other article, I think we can, as long as we're talking about myths, let's talk about the magical soldiers myth. Another article. I'll also put this link in the show notes for our listeners. So I think that the empire myth is coming out of the bottle. I don't know if it can be put back in. And I also think that the other myth that you expose, the magical soldiers myth, which frankly, and I said this at the Thanksgiving table like 10 years ago with 4 veterans with my family. And I said, I think that one of the main reasons why I oppose this Iraq war is that I think they're abusing our troops. I think they're abusing our troops. And there was like dead silence. And I also added in the National Guard too. Like, I don't think they signed up for what they got into. But anyway, so this myth of the magical soldiers, you do a really good job of laying out with specific instances of all the wars that are in recent memory of how this is a myth and why is it not? I think it has been exposed as a myth, but why do they keep doing the same thing over and over again and continue to use this myth?
Well, let me first say just the myth of the magical American soldier goes something like this. The American army is the strongest in the world. The American soldier is the most benevolent but effective fighter in the face of the planet. And if you sprinkle a few hundred or a few thousand troops anywhere in the world, they can solve some problems. People believe this. Think about it. When ISIS reemerged in Iraq, what did the political right and the mainstream political left say? They said it's because Obama, that pacifist, didn't leave 10,000 American soldiers like we told him to. As if 10,000 American soldiers in Baghdad would have somehow stopped the rise of ISIS, which was really formed by socioeconomic and sociopolitical problems in the governance of Iraq itself and in the structure and artificiality of Iraq itself, that somehow the presence of 10,000 soldiers would have stopped that. It wouldn't have. In fact, it might have inflamed it worse. In Afghanistan, they say we can't remove the 14,000 troops that are there today, give or take, because if we do, then Al-Qaeda is coming back and the Taliban's coming back and ISIS will move in and the world will go to shit. But that ignores the fact that the 14,000 American soldiers there are failing. Things are getting worse even with them there. The reality is, if I asked someone who really thought about it and was actually reflective to point to me one instance in which the intervention of American soldiers was actually effective, actually achieved the goals or the missions that were laid out in the beginning, they'd be hard-pressed to name any of them since World War II. Maybe Bosnia, but there are some problematic aspects to that war, specifically in Kosovo.
Right.
So the myth of the magical American soldier, it's a disease. I mean, it is. It is a political disease across the mainstream left and the mainstream right of the United States. And the only people who don't buy it are the hardcore libertarian Republicans like Rand Paul and the more hardcore leftist Democratic Socialists like Bernie Sanders. Everyone else is essentially on board. Probably 90 senators out of 100 are on board with the myth of the magical American soldier. And it's really a tragedy.
I don't think that the American people are on board with it. Based on the reaction that we saw when Obama wanted to bomb and overthrow the Assad regime, and I don't know why I use that word regime. I'm I'm just like brainwashed from the, uh,
Right.
but 2013. So supposedly from some congressman who talked about it, that the response they got on that was like the most overwhelming they had seen in a very long time. Some of them in all of their careers. But I really don't think that most Americans believe in this myth, and I also think that we would be perfectly happy to pull back from. I think that's a big reason why this president got elected, frankly. But I think at this point, we have more of a problem with our allies maintaining this magical soldiers myth than our own citizens. And of course, we have the whole thing about the military industrial complex and the economic, all of that we all know what's going on there. But I really do feel like at this point, particularly in the Middle East, that myth is being upheld more from our allies out of sort of, I don't know, desperation than anything else. I think that's a problem that we need to tackle.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think you're right about the American people. The reason it's a political disease is because our congressional, executive, and judicial representatives are on board with the myth. But I think you're right. I think most Americans don't see the purpose anymore. But the problem is they're not really engaged.
Right.
They're worried about healthcare. They're worried about whether the coal mines are closing. They're worried about immigration, you name it. They're worried about cultural issues like abortion and gay marriage. And foreign policy is a distant, you know, issue for them. And part of the reason is because they don't have to serve in the military, and
Yeah.
neither do their kids. There's no draft, there's no conscription. This government doesn't ask any responsibility from its citizens anymore. It doesn't ask anything from its citizens anymore. Pay your taxes and that's it. Okay, so I'm not saying I want a big drafty army going over to fight these wars. I am saying if there were a draft, the American people would stomp their feet and put an end to this faster than you could say peace movement, faster than you could say Vietnam. They would shut this war down because nobody wants to send their son or daughter to die in Afghanistan. Only volunteers go there. And a very small segment of the population is involved. I mean, most people on the coasts, most people on the liberal East and the liberal West Coast or in the big cities of the Midwest, they don't even know any soldiers. They're not even touched by it. They don't live anywhere near a military base. The only soldiers they see are on TV and maybe in an airport. And they say thank you for your service and buy their meal at TGI Fridays. The reality is they're not connected to the military. So I think you're right that the American people, I don't think the American people are necessarily on board with this whole imperial adventure. They're just apathetic, and that's problematic.
And distracted. I mean, look at. I mean, we're being manipulated. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, let me just interrupt for a second and say distracted is a beautiful word, a beautiful term for it. I saw a statistic that this is a few weeks ago. Stormy Daniels had been mentioned on MSNBC, which supposedly is the liberal network, like 462 times over the course of a month, but Yemen had been mentioned 0 times.
Yeah.
Okay, this is about 3 weeks ago. So it just tells you how distracted our media really keeps the people.
I just noticed. Well, Rand Paul's been speaking out, get out of Yemen, which, God, I hope we can do. And I'd like to talk to you at some other point about some of the other things you've been writing about. The Saudi Arabia angle, which is really a gut wrenching thing. Your article on that, I mean, God. But as far as the myth goes, maybe we should end on that. I think it's related. The magical soldiers myth and the imperial myth are tied together. I think that if we can figure out a way to get some more attention to this, and maybe alternative media is the only way to do that. It's the only way I know how to do it. But it does seem like things are going in that direction. The imperial myth's being exposed, and the magical soldiers myth is being debunked. And I don't know. Maybe this war in Afghanistan is going to end. We have, who was it? Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, he said, we're never leaving. And Colonel Wilkerson said the real reason we're there is to keep an eye on the Pakistani nukes, to give cover for some intelligence operations in China. And I forget what his third reason was. And none of those things are being told to, probably not even to our troops, but certainly not to the people.
Yeah, it's when they say we're never leaving, I mean that's just it's incredibly disturbing. I don't even really know what to do with that, except to say that they're actually right. Um, we aren't leaving these wars anytime soon. We're not leaving Syria, and we're not leaving Iraq, and we're not leaving Afghanistan. I'm going to predict for 25 years, not from today, but total 25 years. The economy is going to have to collapse under the weight of overspending on these wars. I think it's $4.7 trillion by the last count done by Brown University's Study of War Project. It will continue so long as American policymakers continue to believe the myths. And I know you said you wanted to end on myths, and I think there are so many myths. One is that the American soldier is magical. Another is that most people deep down around the world want to be Americans. Like if you unzip a Pakistani, like deep down under the layers of skin, there's an American just waiting to burst out. And that's a myth that a lot of Americans believe, that if people could just be civilized or just be taught the right way or exposed to things, then they would be just little Americans. But the reality is that's never been the case at any moment in human history. People are tied to their cultures, they're tied to their geography, they're tied to their space, and they don't want to be us necessarily. You know, everyone lives differently. Not everyone wants to live in a social democracy like Sweden. I do, but a lot of Americans don't. Just the same, not everyone in Afghanistan, where there's not even friggin' power in half of the country that I was in, not all of them want to be westernized, consumer, corporate, capitalist Americans. And so, I mean, that myth has to be deflated, or we are, as the secretary said, never going to leave.
And, you know, we need to, the leaders in our country and our allies who are all in on this empire, if you will, I mean, they just have to accept that it's not sustainable. And, you know, we need to pull back and operate more like just a normal country again, in my view.
Right. I totally agree with that. 100%.
All right. Anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up?
No, I think that's great. Hopefully I came through well, and you felt it went well. I really enjoyed your questions. They were very solid.
Yeah, it's great. And I hope we can continue our conversations going forward when you have the time. Now, tell everybody where to find you and how to support you.
Yeah. So, first of all, my podcast is Fortress on a Hill. Okay, fortressonahill.com. We're always looking for donations, especially to our Patreon account, where if you jump in to support us, you get some extra articles that I write and some extra episodes. But hey, you can find me on Twitter at Skeptical Vet. I'm at Skeptical Vet, and as well as I'm generally in The Nation, Truthdig, antiwar.com, and the American Conservative 2 to 3 times a week. Google my name, SJURSEN. It's a crazy name, but I'm the only one with it, and you will find my articles every week. So, hey, thanks for having me, and thanks for listening.
That's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And that's our show. Thank you for listening, and a special thanks to Danny Sjursen. Follow him on Twitter at SkepticalVet. Find his work at fortressonahill.com and support that work at patreon.com/fortressonahill. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media, brought to you with the help of our donors. You can pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire. You can do one-time donation on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire. Follow me at Joanne Leon, JoanneLeon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's free. It's growing nicely, but we still need more subscribers to qualify for revenue and live streams. Also hit the thumbs up icon to like the individual videos to help our rankings. Subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast app. We're just about everywhere now on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Stitcher, Google Play, others. If you like the podcast, take a minute to rate it and leave a nice review. It helps. We also have a page on Facebook. See you next time. Take care, everyone.